Good evening. I'm Attorney Lawrence Berliner. Welcome to our ongoing webinars. This is the last one of our series for the 2020-21 school year. With me, I have my co-host, or our co-host, I should say, Jane Faherty, who is the director of the JumpStart program and educational advocate. We have our special guest this evening, Diane Ferber, who's a licensed marriage family therapist. We'll get into introductions in a moment. This webinar is being recorded. I'm providing a disclaimer, and part of that is the webinar is being recorded. The information provided during the webinar does not constitute specific legal advice to you or your child's circumstances and should not be relied upon as such. It does not establish an attorney-client relationship with me, Attorney Lawrence Berliner, or any professional relationship with JumpStart, the Stamford JCC, Jane Faherty, and I will add Diane Ferber as well. By signing up, you have agreed to receive information about future webinars and events from the Stamford Jewish Community Center, myself, the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner. Because this is a Zoom format that we're using, Zoom is a third-party provider and not an agent or associated with the Stamford JCC, Diane Ferber, or the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner. We have received several questions prior to the webinar this evening. You're encouraged to add questions, but please use the Q&A format at the bottom of your computer screen. If you put information in the chat, that is recorded, but information in the Q&A section is not. And speaking of the chat, you will see my contact information. You will see Jane Faherty's contact information, and you will see Diane Ferber's contact information, phone numbers, emails, etc. We are continuing to present these webinars because we are a community of concerned parents and professionals, and we are still learning how to connect and get through these difficult times created by the COVID-19 health emergency. And while we may be dealing with light at the end of the tunnel, we are certainly not out of the tunnel. And I know there's a lot of anxiety, and some people are even panicking as we start to think about the summer and more specifically next school year. We've been moderating a series of webinars to address questions that have and concerns that have come up during this unprecedented time where students are either physically in school, hybrid learning, or in some cases still online learning. And we are trying to address the impact on your child's special education journey, especially as we are moving forward. We've convened with Jane Faherty, our co-host, an educational advocate. She'll tell you a little bit about herself and her background. And as I mentioned before, our special guest this evening is Diane Ferber, who is a licensed marriage family therapist. She will discuss her professional qualifications and background. And we'll be discussing a topic of resetting the school experience as we're going forward, starting now, reviewing the end of the year, possibly planning for the summer, and moving forward for the 21-22 school year. Before we get to that, I do have two announcements. Last time I had encouraged anybody who was watching us to please contact Senator Murphy's office about CASA, which is the Keeping All Students Safe Act. This is a piece of federal legislation sponsored by Senator Murphy for the past several years, and it's finally taking hold. And CASA, Keeping All Students Safe Act, will help prevent the use of seclusion and restraint in school settings. It's a very important piece of federal legislation. And as we were concluding with our last webinar, we were talking about the interim guidance that was coming from the State Department of Education with respect to the 21-22 school year. And what has come out in the meantime is another guidance entitled Guidance Regarding Special Education Recovery for Students with IEPs During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And I think this is the first time our State Department of Education has recognized that students with IEPs may be owed some services that were not delivered either last year, starting with March 2020, and that may have carried over to this year. The guidance is dated May 24th, 2021. It's about 7 pages, and I'm not going to take time away from our co-host and more specifically our guest to go over it, but it's available on the State Department of Education website. The state website is ct.gov, and it's dated May 24th to superintendents and to special ed directors, and it's regarding special education recovery for students with IEP. This may provide some guidance and a path forward for families who feel their child has not received all the mandated services in an IEP, and develop a path to recover, that's a recovery plan, some of that lost educational opportunity. So without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Jane and then in turn to Diane.
Thank you, Lawrence. It's a shame that we've come to the end of this school year and our webinars. It's been a wonderful experience sharing with you, Lawrence and Diane. Thank you for joining us tonight. But we will be resuming again in the fall and probably August. So stay tuned. We'll have some more webinars coming up for you. In the meantime, if you check out the JumpStart's Facebook page, you'll find that there's opportunities to reconnect socially with parents and caregivers that are supporting children or adults, young and old, with developmental disabilities. We have an event this Saturday in Stamford where it's of no cost to participants to go kayaking and enjoy a picnic. And we have another event where you can go out on a schooner and enjoy a sail again at some point. I think it's around the end of June. So please pay attention to the JumpStart's Facebook page for some fun social interaction. And that kind of parlays with the topic today, which is about anxiety and how we've all been dealing with COVID, that we are starting to re-emerge and reconnect and rejoin back out into the community. The JumpStart program that I oversee is located in the Stamford JCC. We primarily support children aged between 2 and 3 with developmental disabilities that travel from all over Fairfield to participate. And I collaborate a lot with the birth to 3 providers, as well as school districts throughout Fairfield to transition those children in. As I've been doing this for a number of years now, I then continue to support and advocate children through the elementary school, and I have a young friend now in middle school. So I oversee programming to help connect and support families, caregivers, and I also do a lot of collaboration with school districts as well as different organizations that support in a plethora of different ways. My background is that I do have a master's in early childhood with special needs. I'm a parent myself of 4 children who are now, half of them will be leaving the nest. The other 2 are going to be juniors and seniors next year. So I relate as a parent. My children did receive some support services when they were younger, OT, speech therapy, as well as RTI training support. So I understand and I understand the challenges of parenting, particularly during this time of COVID, and not only the impact upon the child, but also the impact upon you, the parent, as well. So it's really lovely to have Diane here today to really support and help share her knowledge and expertise on not only supporting the parent, but also the child as we re-emerge from what has been a horrendous year for so many different reasons. But hopefully we can, as Lawrence said, but there's a chink of light at the end of the tunnel now, which we're able to move towards. So thank you for coming tonight, Diane.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both for the introduction, and I'm very, very happy to be here. So my background is preliminarily as a parent of 2 children that were identified as needing special ed services in elementary school. And at that point, I had a career that was unrelated to anything I did now. And I actually went back to school to become a school psychologist. I have a master's in a 6th year so that I could really understand how my children learned and advocate for them because they were not fitting into any bucket. And I found the whole process really bigger than I was at the time. So I want to first identify as a parent sitting with you at your end as well. My children are now in their 20s and they're doing beautifully, but it was not a straightforward process in sort of getting them into the independent adults that they are now. So I was, as I said, a school psychologist, but I also have a master's and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist because I recognize that when a child is, exceptional in the very many ways we can all be exceptional, there's an impact on the family as well. And a child does best when the family is also supportive of the child and working in partnership with the school. So I felt that that training was also really important to support these kids. At this point, I have a private practice in Stamford and I work at another practice in Bridgeport at this point. I am working with families and children and see all of the anxiety. I can give you the numbers, but I don't think I have to give you the numbers. But clearly, one of the big themes over the summer and all the research coming out is how to help our children, both typical learners and those that are exceptional, recalibrate, reset, reentry, repair, and it's all these R words. But I also think there's an opportunity for them to reimagine themselves over the summer, to look at it as what have I learned about myself as a learner and as a person, and what have I missed and what worked for me and what didn't. And as we move forward, supporting them, sort of reimagining how they want to be in this year ahead. I'm going to just give you a top line of where all the research is. All of the kids have academically sort of moved away from sort of the norm in what they've learned this year. Some children do better at home, some don't do as well at home, some have had loss in their families. Basically, there is a need for all children to sort of catch up even into their grade level a little bit. And there's a lot of anxiety in our families, for our parents and our children, for their academic performance that might have dipped over this past year, or they've done well and now they have to go back to reentry when they're a highly anxious child. But one of the biggest sort of takeaways from almost every single research study out there so far is that the summer is a best time for these children to re-engage socially and emotionally. That isolation year has, if you think about a child, 1 year developmentally is a huge chunk out of their lives. And that deficit is as important to their academic success and personal coping and independence and ability to get along in the world as their academics. So the top line recommendations are encourage social interactions, not virtual, face-to-face. Allow children to take the independence that they're capable of, social elements, social interactions, problem solving, being able to tolerate a little bit of frustration in those things that are hard for them so they can sort of re-enter their full developmental selves.
So, Diane, what do you say to the parent that is very concerned about the regression that they've seen in their child? Regression across the cognitive domain, across the communication, across the social emotional, mathematics, literature. So parents are very concerned, and understandably so, that their child has regressed academically as well as in other areas.
Sure.
What steps or strategies can you recommend to the parents to have a balance this summer? Obviously, so that to provide the child with the supports that they need so that they don't continue to regress and hopefully start to regain some of that lost ground that may have occurred this past year, but also strike the balance between allowing their child to have more social experiences and to start to maybe reconnect depending on the child, in a small way or a much bigger way, with their peers and within their community? What advice do you give for parents to create that balance?
And I think the point is well taken. There needs to be a balance because the academic concerns are as important as the social emotional concerns. But I will also put out the idea that one sort of supports the other. So a child who is super anxious, or a child who feels really isolated or has lost all of those activities that help them settle in, all of the physical activities, the social activities, the sports, the recess, the running around, the fun things that they do, that child may not be as prepared to re-engage academically unless those needs are also met. You can think about yourself when you're really anxious or you're really angry and you drive by your exit. Each one of us knows exactly where we live. But when our amygdala is in that, like, you know, anxious moment phase, or we can't, it doesn't matter that we want to get home, we're going to drive by our exits. And children's brains, if you think about it, there's so much social, emotional development at a child's age versus an adult's. So 1 year is missing a lot. And in those years, if they've been very anxious this year, they might have like a fight or flight kind of reaction to anxiety right now, because we've all been anxious. Parents have been anxious. The world has been anxious. So they've absorbed that, and they may be on a little bit of hypervigilance alert. So there's a real need to recognize that taking a step back and sort of getting them to recalibrate emotionally will actually have an impact on their ability to take advantage of and excel on the academic makeup and support that we'll give them. I think all of our children have regressed in many ways. Sometimes maybe not academically. There are some anxious kids who loved being at home online. But likely they're feeling a lot of anxiety about going back to school because they've socially regressed, or frustration tolerance has not been as tested and developed. So I think all of our children need that balance, and each individual child, the parents knows their child best. But I would also ask the child what they'd like to do a little bit for the summer, because I think our children realize they've had very little control over their lives. And if they know that they have to do all of these things, but they get to choose some of those things, they are more likely to be compliant with the entire program of re-entering.
And Lawrence, what conversation would you have or suggest a parent could potentially have with the school district to have a balanced curriculum during ESY?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I'm going to take a step back and say that a parent should start with having a conversation with their child. Because I think when you really, I think we assume a lot of things about our children, and we also have a lot of our own ideas of what's important for them. So prior to that, I'm going to suggest you sort of have a conversation with your child, sort of reframing what success means. What was successful this year for us? What was not successful? How do you know when you're doing well? How do you know when this didn't go well? What did you try? Sort of having this conversation that also, you know, again, it's going to be different by developmental level and the age of the child or their exceptionality, but sort of reconnecting with them. And you know, face-to-face talks with your child when you've been home all year is not going to happen. So I'm going to suggest going for a drive with them, or doing an activity with them where conversation, an art project, whatever your child enjoys. What are they worried about coming back? What have they missed? What did they really like about it? So that when you go to the district, you go with a real sense of what your child has also learned and what their greatest fears are. Because it's very different going to the district and saying, I'm really worried about my child re-engaging and they're really frightened. And so I'm thinking this versus this really worked well, this didn't. How do we address this fear while leveraging the strength that my child showed here is a very different conversation.
Those are good points and excellent advice, because there's a lot of anxiety, whether people realize it or not. A lot of people don't want to acknowledge the anxiety, or the children are very good at masking it in school, but they bring it home. So that's excellent advice for families, and certainly taking into account the child's interests, because as you point out, we make a lot of assumptions about our children, but this past year and a half, the whole world has changed. And I think the assumptions have to change as well on the part of schools, parents, and the like. We had a few questions before we logged on tonight. And one of them, what do you do when both parents and teachers do not both agree that a full inclusion program may not be best way to support a child or a student in school? Any suggestions, thoughts?
So, I think every child is different. We tend to look at this as a monolith of, a child with special needs. But if you have a child for whom you believe non-full inclusion is the best model, that conversation is really important. And I think it's the context of why you think that, and how do you create a balance for that child with all of the expertise. A true child study team, a true conversation with experts and teachers and parents really should be able to talk about that and figure out what that specific child needs. And if that child needs it in the short run, if it's something that would sort of change maybe over the year, given different milestones, and just really have that frank conversation about concerns and science and this past year. I think there's going to be a lot of conversations that are around individual children, and I think everybody needs to be heard. And I think the more frank conversations that we have that's child specific, I think is always best.
I think also just from a parental perspective that it's important for the parents maybe to find a third party person to talk to, someone such as Diane, to get together and decide together what you both believe is the right educational environment for your child before you go into a PPT meeting, and make sure that you're both understanding the environment that you both wish to seek for your child, because your perception might be different to your partner's perception, because you might have had different educational experiences growing up. So I think it is important, there is a value to talk to someone such as Diane to tease out together what the educational environment is that you are seeking to acquire for your child, and to discuss the pros and the cons of those environments. What do you think to that, Diane? Do you think?
I think that's an excellent point. We bring to the conversations about our own children's education so much of unconscious experiences, values, and even culture of how we ourselves were raised and our own experiences. And often we're not even aware of that until we come across with a very, very strong opinion about something. Often that means you should think about kind of where that comes from, and the more communication around it. I found when I've met with parents who have a disagreement about either educational direction or even schools, often when you take a step back, what they are both bringing to the table is a specific solution they've become wed to, but actually if you can take a step back, they have a common understanding and view of the problem. So, I think learning how to have those conversations without the full emotional content of what we bring to the table, our own fears, and if we lose our flexibility because we have a solution that we feel is best, you almost always can kind of go back, because at the end of the day, everybody wants what's best for their child, and you start back there and you move forward, and you can almost always end up in a place that's very similar.
Lawrence, can you explain to the families that are listening tonight the continuum of education and what it is when you're presented with considering the most restrictive versus the least restrictive? Because I've done a number of PPTs recently, and the district used the jargon, most restrictive, least restrictive, but parents don't necessarily know what that means. Can you explain the continuum of education and what their rights are as a parent towards that?
Is that for me or for Diane?
For you, Lawrence.
Okay, I just want to clarify. There is no such thing as inclusion. What we have, as Jane pointed out, is the least restrictive environment. And what the federal law states is all children with disabilities have a right to be educated alongside children without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. And often right at that point in time where there's a comma, some people put a period. And what the regulation goes on to say, unless the child is not deriving satisfactory benefit or progress. If that is established, then the school district has to have what's called a continuum of alternative placements. We always start with a neighborhood school. We always start with a regular classroom environment, but we don't always end up there. And points on the continuum could be bringing supports into the regular classroom, having a combination of regular classroom resource room supports, where the child spends some time in the regular classroom and gets a little more individualized instruction in a resource room. Another point further down the continuum is a self-contained program, where the student is basically in a self-contained, mostly isolated program, most if not all the school day. Some schools have 2 high schools. Maybe the high school at the other side of town has a better array of services, or the middle school on the other side of town has a better array of services, or one middle school might have some resources or a teacher who's more specialized with his or her training than your local school. So that's another option, a public school located elsewhere in the district. And the next continuum point is out of district placements. And in Connecticut, like most states, we have a list of approved private special education schools. And in Connecticut, PPTs are told, school districts through the PPT are told by the State Department of Education to make, if you're going to make an out-of-district placement, you can only make it at an approved private special ed school. So the State Department of Education has a list, about 80 or so schools. ct.gov is the state's website. If you can make the case, or the school district makes the case, that the child needs an out-of-district placement, it could be an out-of-district day school, it could be an out-of-district residential school, it could be an out-of-district in-state placement, it could be an out-of-district out-of-state placement. Whether it's the local school or an out-of-district placement, we're all looking at whether the placement, the program, the placement, the IEP is providing the student with a free, appropriate public education. FAPE is the acronym. And we want to make sure children have IEPs that are based upon their unique needs. We want to make sure that the goals and objectives are meaningful, robust, addressing all areas of the child's disability. That's where the evaluations come in. Most important, that's where parent input and concerns come in, because parents are an important source of information regarding their child. And all of this is supposed to be put together in an IEP document with goals, objectives, reasonable accommodations, academic instruction, related services for the older child, meaning approximately 14, 15 years old, a transition plan, all promoting a free, appropriate public education. And while this year and the last year are not the most typical years, what I used to say was, What a parent should do in the month of June is look back to the month of September and say, these were the gaps that we identified in September, and after a school year, we're seeing the gaps close. So that's meaningful progress. When the parents are seeing trivial or no progress, that's not appropriate progress, as in free appropriate public education. So all of this is supposed to be done on an individual basis, not a categorical basis. And school districts shouldn't have predetermination, meaning they've already made up their mind ahead of time. And parents should also have an open mind, because maybe, just maybe, the school district has something new to offer, or maybe the school district actually agrees with the parent who needs an out-of-district placement, or maybe the parents will agree with a school district that recommends an out-of-district placement. But we always start with that presumption. It's a rebuttable presumption that children with disabilities will be educated alongside children without disabilities. Because in addition to being a funding statute, the federal special ed law is also a civil rights law. And the civil rights that was created by Congress in 1975 was a right for a public education for children with disabilities, because there were many states in America that excluded children from public schools because of their disability. Fortunately, Connecticut was not one of them. We have been providing a form of special education since the mid-1960s. The federal law was passed in 1975 and became effective in 1977. And that's where we are today.
And I think that's the key. The key is to know your child and to have the conversation with the district and to go with an open mind, but also to know what your rights are, as Lawrence so clearly articulated about FAPE and the continuum of educational placement. It's important to be aware of your options as a parent, but also last year during COVID, or this year during COVID, everybody said that we should start to be creative in the way in which we consider education and the way in which we might deliver education, which has happened on different platforms in different ways. I was at a PPT recently, we were talking about ESY, and it was really nice to see the district work creative. So to Diana's point that this child needed the academic elements, so that was built into their day. However, there was an acknowledgement that they needed to re-immerse themselves back with socialize with typical peers and to have those social opportunities, to have fun and to reconnect and be engaged to being a kid again, as well as just a student. So the district came up with a very creative plan at no cost or expense to the parents, where the child would spend 5 hours of the day within an academic support system in line with their existing IEP, but the remainder of the day was spent socializing and having fun in a typical camp offered within the district to children that do not have IEPs, to create that balance, which is where we began the conversation with Diane's pointing out that children need to get back out and climb and run and move their bodies and feel safe doing those things again as well. Dan, do you have any other comments to connect to that?
No, I think that was an amazingly articulate summary of the discussion. The only thing I would add is if you have trouble having those conversations with your child for whatever reasons, one of the things that's sort of a play way to do it is to institute a check-in for your family. So for the adults and the children, where 1 is the worst day ever and 10 is the best day ever. How do you feel today? And so that's sort of a check-in, you know, for a child who may not sit down and go, I'm really, really feeling this or that, or I'm worried about this. It's giving a number and a level in a kind of a playful way where the parents are also participating, so the children can watch the parents handle bad days and understand them, but also to check in with your child as the world sort of opens up and they re-engage in some activities that they haven't done all year over the summer. So that's also a really good tool to have in place before September.
And I just want to add to one comment to Jane. When you're talking about rights, we're talking about the procedural safeguards And there is a new procedural safeguard booklet that has been released, I think the end of March or April thereabouts. So make sure when the school district is offering your procedural safeguards, you have the latest version,
Yeah.
2006 or 2008 version, one that has a 2021 date on the cover.
And so Lawrence, we just received this question in. What rights do homeschoolers have to an IESP if they not have previously been in the Connecticut public schools?
Well, if the person is talking about an IEP or an IFSP for a birth of 3 child, for an IEP, usually you have to be registered with the school district. You have to be on the rolls of the school district, and parents who are homeschooling, that's not homebound tutoring, but homeschooling their children, and unfortunately have no rights in Connecticut unless they're part of the school district. And if they are part of the school district, a child, and they have a child with an actual or suspected disability, the whole process starts with a referral to special education, a PPT meeting, a pupil planning team meeting. And for people who are in New York, that's the same of the CSE meetings in New York. I know we have some people from out of state, but I'm focused on Connecticut. The PPT will decide, will review the parents' concerns, decide what evaluations should be conducted. Under Connecticut law, the school can take up to 45 school days to complete their evaluations and have the second PPT meeting already scheduled within that 45-day period to discuss whether or not the child has a disability. We have 14 categories of disability in Connecticut. What is the adverse impact upon education? And then if eligible under one of the 14 categories of eligibility, we write an initial IEP. Goals, we identify strengths and weaknesses. Those are the present level academic performance pages. And the weaknesses that have been identified, we are going to write goals and objectives to help remediate the areas of weakness. There may be academic goals, there may be social and emotional goals, there might be speech and language goals, physical therapy, occupational therapy, to name a few related services. And we put it all together and say the child will receive so much instruction per day, per week in each of the areas. And the last thing that's supposed to be decided is where this should take place, the placement. Sometimes I'm at PPT meetings and the placement is the first thing that's decided. Well, that should be the last thing that's decided once we have put the IP together. And under Connecticut law, as it exists right now, unless you're registered with the school district, you have no claim on the services. There might be different in other states, but that's the way it is here in Connecticut.
So in terms of homebound tutoring or homeschooling versus homebound tutoring services, Diane, have you had, can you talk in terms of a parental, in terms of the different stress or strain it might put on a parent with those two options? Because I think when I've been talking to parents recently, there's a little bit of confusion between homeschooling versus homebound tutoring.
So I think this is more Larry's area, because I think it's actually a legal distinction. My understanding is homebound tutoring, homebound instruction is a temporary short-term bridge for a child who for some reason has to be out of school with the expectation that they will return, which is distinct from home schooling or home tutoring and schooling as an education alternative.
That's correct. The homeschool children, the parents are the Board of Education, they're the teachers, they're in charge of their child's education. I'm not familiar with the exact name of the organization, but there is an organization in Connecticut of homeschool parents. Maybe Google it, you'll come up with it. They share resources and strategies, and they're completely independent, bypassing the public school system. For a child with homebound tutoring, that means Under state law, state regulations, it could be a child with a temporary medical condition. Let's say they broke their leg skiing and they're laid up in bed, unable to get to school. Homebound tutoring can be provided for that student. Also, students who are pregnant, it's in the regulation. But for my clients, most of the time, homebound tutoring is they have a quote, verified medical reason, end quote, that's verified by a medical doctor, it could be a psychiatrist, a physician, somebody with an MD or similar designation, not a psychologist, not a social worker. And I have nothing against social workers or psychologists. It's just the way the regulation was written, which I might add over much parental opposition many years ago, but that's another story for another day. And a doctor has to fill out a form that should be readily available, not a secret. The doctor has to have a conversation with a school health professional, typically a school nurse, to explain why my patient has a verified medical reason, why my patient cannot be in school, the expected or anticipated date they might return to school, and what kind of homebound services are you recommending? Often that's quantitative, not qualitative, meaning I'm recommending 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, rather than a specific program. So depending whether the child's in regular education, the one who's sitting home with a broken leg and recovering, they're probably going to work off the curriculum that the student was working, the core curriculum, that is. For a child with an IEP, it might be the core curriculum, or it might be the IEP goals and objectives. And as Diane pointed out, it's supposed to be temporary, and the operative word in that sentence, suppose. I've had kids on homebound tutoring for years. I had one a couple of years ago for maybe 2.5 years, because out of sight, out of mind. Now, homebound tutoring was supposed to be a temporary expediency. The child can't be in school. All right, maybe we need to explore alternative placements. Maybe we need to do some evaluations. Maybe we need to do something rather than nothing during the period of time the student's on homebound, and then we regroup and decide what next steps are. So that's the state law on homebound tutoring.
I'm wondering if a lot of the parents who have had children who are highly anxious or have social deficits that actually did academically better at home are now wondering, those districts that are not allowing remote learning come September, how they can come up with an alternative homebound, where it would fit into the law. And again, not my area, but I would make also the case that homeschooling in its full supportive complement of a child's development includes paying attention to them developing frustration tolerance, interactive skills, being exposed to other values and way of thinking. So it's not so much just your child sitting at home and doing academics, because that isolation without that social, emotional, or group learning opportunities that the more traditional and expanded homeschooling experiences and curriculums will integrate, can actually work against your child, because it bubbles your child in a artificial place where you're feeding one capability to their strengths, but sort of ignoring their development of areas that might be harder for them. And in fact, when a child has anxiety about something, it means it's something that's hard for them. And in some, we don't want to avoid anything that ever gives a child anxiety. None of us would grow. None of us would ever have gone on a job interview. None of us would ever have gone to college. None of us would ever have left our homes, actually. But the idea is to teach a child to handle that anxiety and to control the level of exposure to the thing that creates the anxiety to such a small degree that they have successes that they could scaffold on until they've conquered that, and then recognize, wow, I can take that success and apply it to other areas of my anxiety. So for the parents who recognize that their child actually did better at home and it was less stress for them because they weren't getting calls from the school, for example, about their child in a fight or having a meltdown and going to the bathroom and not coming back, or the 100 ways children demonstrate at school that they're overwhelmed. Recognize, though, that there is a certain importance to their social emotional development in those experiences, as long as they're not thrown at the child and overwhelming. So somewhere between bubble and back at school full-time may be appropriate. And again, it's a child by child kind of thing.
We had received another question before the webinar about a child who will be a senior, looks like for next year, who's on either going to be on remote learning or homebound next year. And the parent is asking about whether the student can go to the graduation ceremony with his or her peers, even though they don't have enough high school credits to graduate. What are the laws? What are some of the suggestions on how this parent might be working with the school district to make this senior year a meaningful and enjoyable experience for that student? Any thoughts? I have one.
I don't have the question in front of me, so I was unclear. Did the child not complete all of the requirements for graduation and have to go back another year?
It just says my child will not have earned enough credits to, quote, walk with the peers.
Mm-hmm.
My suggestion is you can have a social graduation. Now, this presumes that the child has an IEP. I don't know if this child's in regular education or not. But we have had many situations, or I have in my career, where we arrange for a social, not a legal graduation, precisely because the student's not ready to graduate, yet they have been, in some cases, with this group of students since kindergarten or elementary school, middle school, or certainly high school, and they want to participate in the rites of passage of going to a graduation ceremony and any other parts of the, there are social graduations that happen all the time where the student does everything except receive the physical diploma. And if the school does not allow that, if the child has an IEP, they should reconsider their position. This is supported by the Department of Education. You could file an informal complaint called a CRP complaint, a complaint resolution complaint, with the State Department of Education, and ask that they investigate this or ask the principal or superintendent to reconsider their decision. And the other part of the question is access to senior activities. I don't know what that means, but if we're talking about the prom, the question comes up, if you can't go to school because you're on homebound or remote learning, then why can you go to the prom or the football game or something like that? So I always advise parents, be consistent, and maybe you're going to have to, focus on graduation ceremony and maybe not the senior activities, whatever those are, like maybe a prom or a dance or some outing, because if your child cannot go to school physically, then maybe they can't go to the senior outing or the field trip. One last thought is ask for this in writing as a reasonable accommodation to your child's disability, whether it's the graduation, the senior outing, whatever, and see what the school comes back with as a response. Those are some of my suggestions.
I so agree with your celebrating the graduation as a social event and not the necessarily the other. One of the things that I've really noticed in the pandemic, when things had been taken away from students, like a graduation or a prom earlier, at the end of last year, sometimes the parents were so upset about their child missing out on a milestone that was so important to them that they missed out on the fact that the kids ignored the parents and went ahead and created some, in some cases online, in some cases some other experiences that were just as meaningful to them. And the parents ended up transmitting, oh my goodness, this is such a calamity that you're missing out. You must feel horrible when the child didn't necessarily. So one is first check in with your child to make sure that whatever you think, I mean, and again, I don't mean talk just this specific case, but whatever activity or milestone or event that you feel your child, you know, is being robbed of, and this is like something you're feeling really upset about, check in and make sure your child, before you transmit that to them, actually feels that loss as acutely as you do. I've had kids say, I was so grateful there was no prom. I was dreading the prom. And instead we all did this and it was fabulous. One town I know did like a whole remote gaming like around town that the parents got involved with points and a whole crazy system instead of a dance that actually included more children. So again, I think kids can be, this is their own experience. This is their year. This is their journey to have figured out this year in a year that none of us have ever experienced. And just because it's a loss to us doesn't always mean it's a loss to them.
I completely agree, Diane, because my son last year, Harry, was the first one in my family to be graduating from high school. I'm not American. We don't really have graduation in the UK from high school as such. We take A-level exams posted on a big notice board so everybody can see them. It's a very different experience. Yeah. So, and it was interesting because, so I had no expectation as to what a graduation would feel like. And Harry has obviously never experienced a graduation with a full regalia, cap and gown. So he didn't know what he was missing. I didn't know what he was missing. And instead we had a car parade, which for us was both a novel new experience and it was tremendous. We thoroughly enjoyed it, not knowing what we would have been missing anyway. And this year, my daughter is graduating with an in-person graduation, but the district acknowledged the success and the joy during the car parade. So they're actually going to have both events this year.
That's great. Good for them.
So to your point, though, sometimes as parents, we project what our experiences have been or what we think our child are going to feel or want their experiences to be based upon our own. And that isn't always the case. To your point, it's about connecting and communicating with them. And to Lawrence's point, communication, we've said this whole year, is fundamental and key with the district. Connect and communicate with the principal, connect and communicate with the team, and have a conversation about, could my child participate in a social way during graduation? What would that look like? What could that feel like? It goes back to communication and not making assumptions about what a district is going to say or think or feel ahead of time. Be open and receptive to having the dialogue would be my recommendation.
Absolutely. And also, if you know, don't be wedded to your solution. So if they can't walk, but they can participate in the other activities, senior day or whatever that school provides, present the problem to the school as well. He wants to acknowledge that he has been with these peers all of these times. How do we help him celebrate and acknowledge his camaraderie with his peers? Because that's important for him, while still, you know, having fidelity to your rules. And so be open to problem solving with your district and your principal.
So Lawrence,
I was just going to say the ongoing communication thing that Jane just talked about dovetails with a question that we just received during the webinar, where a student is not doing well at an out-of-district placement, quote, bottomed out in March, missed a significant amount of the fourth quarter, but had A's and B's in the 3 previous quarters. What should that parent do? And I think the communication with the school, the private school where they are, and the public school, because if it's a public school, they're going to have to accept the grades or not, and try to work out an equitable solution. I have had situations where students are completely unable to do any work, and some teachers will average a grade. Some schools will say you did A's and B's for 3 quarters, we'll average that into 4 quarters, and that'll be your final grade. There's no specific law. It's sort of best practices, what's fair and equitable, and that requires ongoing communication. That's what Jane was talking about in a different context, but that context applies to, grades as well.
Lawrence, the question we were asked before tonight's webinar, again about communication. When should a parent or shouldn't a parent file a state complaint? Can you give some examples maybe as to when it might be reasonable to or prudent to versus not?
Yeah, we actually, I think we try to answer that question offline. I think it was coming from another state that we weren't familiar with, but speaking in general, there's not an exact right or wrong way to file a state complaint. And when I talk about state complaint, I'm talking about a CRP, complaint resolution complaint. This is not a request for a due process hearing where there's a denial of a free, appropriate public education. Often I file a CRP complaint with our State Department of Education here in Connecticut because the IEP as written is not being implemented by the school district. And so we're asking for a remedy like compensatory hours, make up for the lost hours. Or I had a case a few years ago, the school district had an overly restrictive policy on independent evaluations that conflicted with the expectations in federal law. And I filed a CRP complaint with the State Department of Education, and the department told them to change the policy and make it less onerous, less restrictive. They put an artificial cap, I think, of $2,000 on a psychological evaluation. And I don't know any psychologist that would do a comprehensive evaluation east of the Mississippi River for $2,000. Maybe they do it west of the Mississippi, but not around here. And the state told them to change their policy by not necessarily changing the cap, but allowing on a case-by-case basis an exception to the policy. In other words, the policy is fine, but I can't find a psychologist who's going to charge less than $5,000. So I want an exception to the policy. So that's how that CRP process can be used. And I remember that person was this going to have lingering effects? It's not supposed to. And I'm a lawyer, I litigate cases, but I try not to make it personal. But I know on the other side, people feel their feelings are being hurt or they feel they're being attacked. And I do my best not to make it personal. It's about the child. It's not about me. The child is not succeeding in school. Let's make it better. I'm not here to blame this teacher for not being a good teacher any more than I want to hear the teacher blame my client for being a bad parent, because that gets us nowhere. So let's focus on where do the wheels go off the track and how to get this child back on track with the least amount of litigation, recrimination, and aggravation, because the focus should be on the child, not anybody else, to make sure they're succeeding.
And then Diane, we had another question that was submitted before the webinar tonight. How best to support children who are intelligent yet have anxiety? The school, in this case, the school is happy with the fact that they are on grade level, even though it's the lowest part of the grade level, yet with support and IQ, the child should be capable of much more. The actual environment, too many people in class, changing classes, too many variables and different expectations for each class is causing poor academic outcome. And so what advice would you have for that family with regard to the anxiety and how to support the child in those situations?
So I think my answer might change a little bit if we were talking about an elementary school child versus a high school child, but just sort of in general. When we have and I have been a parent, so I've had, what's clearly a really intelligent child with such crippling anxiety at points that they were not able to perform, which is really what academic grades are about. It's a combination of your intellect, your capability of knowing the material, and being able to get through your day and demonstrate that in a standardized way in the classroom. So, I'm of two minds as a parent, but I'm going to take the perspective I am now looking back at what I did and looking at my child now being a functional, independent kid in grad school, gratefully, and sort of answer it this way. My inclination was to try to maximize my child's capabilities to show his intelligence and bubble wrap him, to avoid those things that would throw him. But if you think about the things on that list, which is changing rooms, lots of other kids, those are things and skills and tolerances that child is going to need to be successful and show his intellect capability and functionality in the world at large. So again, when a child is so overwhelmed by them that they shut down completely, you know that they don't have the coping strategies to handle it, and you want to pull those things back and scaffold them up so they can gain confidence. But you know, it's very frustrating when you have a child that you know is super, super capable and intelligent, and you're being told, well, C is average, you know, they're doing fine with, why are you unhappy? And so I get that. But I would say that one of the functions of school and our handling of our children who are exceptional is to work on the whole child, because our goal is not so much to get all A's. Our goal really is to have a child that goes out into the world as independent as possible, as confident as possible, with a history of having overcome challenges and overcome things that were hard for them. So it is a balance. And I would just say, I would tell my parental younger self to sort of not bubble the child, but pay a lot of attention and be that voice when you think your child's overwhelmed, but also acknowledge that a C at school does not translate anywhere into success or even getting into a good college or success beyond it. Your child's intellect is the thing they get to keep. You want them to love learning, you want them to love school, and you want them to be comfortable people who are able to demonstrate those things.
And I agree, because the purpose of special education, and this is in the preamble, is to prepare students with disabilities to further their education, to become competitively employed, and to live independently. And we can't start too early in their lives to prepare them for that. And it may take them a little longer than a child sitting next to them, but we want them to come out on the other side, be as educated as possible, go off to college, get degrees, certificates, licenses, professional degrees, whatever, being happy at what you're doing and successful, and become competitively employed so you're self-sufficient and you have the skills that you need to live independently in whatever community you decide you want to live in. I'm going to take part of a question that we received before the webinar because we're running out of time, and this is a student who where the school district wants to eliminate remote learning next year, as most of them do. How can I get remote learning? Well, we start by asking for it. The technology is still there, the cameras, the platforms, whether the schools are going to use it. I know I saw an article a couple of weeks ago, there are no more snow days. So we're going to use remote learning days when the schools are inaccessible due to inclement weather. Well, why not, if that technology is still there, why not use it for this child? And the corollary question is, what are the privacy issues? The schools are talking about privacy. And the answer is there's a federal law called FERPA, F-E-R-P-A, Family Education Privacy Rights Act, that protects the confidentiality of student records. And there's a definition of records. Now, if the school districts have been able to do remote learning last year and doing remote or hybrid learning this year, the same privacy issues that existed this year or last year were resolved. And so it shouldn't be, the FERPA or privacy issue should not be used as a barrier to the parents' request to continue remote learning. And then lastly, ghetto letter from the doctor, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, who's ever involved with your child to support your request for remote learning and explain the reasons why we need an accommodation. The policy may be perfectly fine. We have no more remote learning. You want an exception to the policy, and the policy exception is supported by information. You know, the child has anxiety or some other issues that are preventing him or her from being in school on a full-time basis.
I think it also goes back to data. Lawrence, we've been talking all year about, as parents, you have been educators, you've been therapists, you have created the classroom in your home environment. If you have data to support that your child has made progress and indeed made exceptional gains while being taught remotely, use that data that you have collected over this past 12-month period and use that to support your arguments to quantify and qualify why your child would benefit from continuing their education in a remote format and platform. So you're not just talking about your sensibilities and what you think or what you would like, but you're substantiating it with facts and data that have been collected not only by you, but the district over the 3 or 4 marking periods of this last year. All of those pieces could help support the conversation and the discussion potentially with the district.
Good points. We have 2 final questions, and they deal with out-of-district placements. One is for a student who's very aggressive, and the parent doesn't. I'm not 100% sure what the parent is trying to do, but keep the child in the out-of-district placement or obtain an out-of-district placement. And that's the second question. What should I do if I feel my child should have an out-of-district placement? The process is the same. If you remember earlier today, we were talking about the least restrictive environment. An out-of-district placement is part of that continuum of alternative placements. So you have to make a case that the child is not receiving a free, appropriate public education in the in-district placement, wherever that is. And usually I have evaluation reports or letters from psychiatrists or pediatricians or therapists who are involved with the family, who are supporting the family's decision or request for an out-of-district placement. And while it's not necessary that you have an acceptance letter in hand when you go to a PPT meeting to request an out-of-district placement, it is certainly a good idea that the parents have done some kind of due diligence on their part by contacting schools or doing online interviews or maybe having their child visit virtually or in person with some of the schools. So you can make the case brick by brick why the public school placement is not working and why an out-of-district placement is necessary, whether it's for a child with an emotional disability, a learning disability, autism, or other types of disabilities, where many times students with those disabilities are educated in district, and many times they need a more specialized out-of-district setting. But all of this is based upon communication, evaluations, data. As Jane pointed out, parents are an excellent source of information. You know, you see your child in multiple settings, especially this past year. If you were the teacher, you were the paraprofessional, you were the related service provider because your child was on remote learning, you have you don't have to ask how your child did in school today. You saw how he or she did in school because it was happening, in front of you. So these are all, there's no one size fits all answer. This is all done on an individual basis. So for anybody that's seeking an out-of-district placement, you have to first establish that the public school placement in the IEP is not legally appropriate. And that's usually where evaluators, advocates, lawyers, consultants come in to help support the family. So I don't know if there are any more questions that we need to get to because the hour is late. So I'm going to first thank Diane and Jane for being the co-host for tonight's webinar. We have covered a lot of topics in this past school year. And for those that have been with us throughout the past year on a regular basis, we welcome you and your continued support. For anybody that's joining us new, we're going to be back next year. We're taking the summer off, but we will keep a watchful eye on developments that are occurring on the state and federal level. And there will be a lot of developments. There's a lot of policies that are in draft form because we are having a new school year. It's just we're ending this one. So let's get this one over, and probably over the summer, there'll be more policies. Interim guidance will become permanent guidance, more guidance letters coming from the state or US Department of Education. So we'll try to address the changing aspects of education as we are still dealing with a fluid situation with the pandemic still around us. Our hope, expectation is we'll be past this by the time school resumes in the fall. We'll have periodic announcements as to when our next webinar will be scheduled, who our guests will be. In advance of the webinars, we always welcome your questions. I hope everybody will take Diane's advice on how to structure the summer and not necessarily send your child to school, but send them somewhere where they can develop their emotional learning and social skills, something that hasn't been there for quite some time, at least the way it used to be. So without further ado, I want to hope everybody remains safe and healthy. And I'll turn this over to both Jane and Diane for any concluding remarks.
I'd just like to thank Diane for coming tonight, and it's been lovely to reconnect with you, and I'm glad that we were able to establish each other. It's been wonderful to see you again tonight, Diane, and thank you so much for reminding parents to consider the child holistically and not just focus on one element, which might be academic. So thank you for sharing that. And please stay connected to our Facebook page, JumpStart, for social activities during the summer. And if parents, if you have any ideas or suggestions on webinar topics that you would like Lawrence and I to address, by all means, email those to us. And we are putting together the program for next year. Diane will hopefully come back and join us again at a later date.
Very much so.
Looking forward to it.
So please, please share with us any topics that are of particular interest to you that we can address next year.
Thank you so much for having me. And this is a wonderful series you've put together. Thank you for doing such a great thing through a pandemic. This was fabulous.
Well, we couldn't do it with without people like you volunteering their time and energy to be with us. And for those who have proposed topics or questions that we have built the webinars around contemporary issues that are happening with the families and others who are there each and every day. So I want to thank Rachel, my daughter, who has throughout the past year or so, who's put this all together. In effect, she's my producer, Jane's producer as well. And she's the one that's putting the contact information. For those who want to have a recording, you'll get a recording from Rachel. And without Rachel, we could not, doing all the work behind the scenes, we could not be doing all the work that we're doing that you see in front. It's a lot of labor effort, a lot of technical skills, energy that goes into getting this ready. So I thank my daughter, Rachel, and certainly Jane and our distinguished guest this evening, Diane. So thank you and enjoy the summer, and we'll see you in the fall.
Enjoy the summer. Bye.